Thank you so much for that extraordinary intro, and thank you for having me here. And to all of you in the audience, indeed, apologies, I can't be there in person, but I'm thrilled to be here virtually. Oh, also, and on the math wrap thing, if somebody remembers that line all the way to Q&A, if you want, we can do a bit of wrap at the end. So I'm going to be speaking about token-based communities and optimal membership design. This is going to be a framework, as the name suggests. It actually references another piece of that intro. You know, I'm very involved in a bunch of different NFT communities and projects, both as sometimes as an advisor, sometimes as a consumer. We're going to be thinking today about how do you actually structure membership in a community, and we're going to frame that, as we'll see, in as a mechanism design problem. But first, this talk has perhaps the longest preamble of any talk I've ever given. So let me quickly run us through several preamble remarks. First of all, this is joint work with many different co-authors across many different collaborations. Most principally, Steve Kaczynski, my co-author on the Everything token. We met through NFT space, in fact, through one of these communities, and I promise I'll say what I mean by that in a moment. And we have a book in, I guess now done, basically coming out in January, that talks about how you can, sort of understand NFTs as digital deeds that form a structure on which you can build not just ownership, but many other things: utility, identity, community, and a brand's evolution. A lot of the early part of the talk will be sort of reflecting those sorts of ideas. And then once we get to the mechanism design framework, I'll be speaking mostly about work joint with Piotr Dvorak, Chenghua Li, and Marco Reuter on what's called, or what we're calling, optimal membership design. This, as you'll see, also borrows a lot from Piotr's and my general program on redistributive allocation mechanisms, joint work with Mohammed Akbarpour, and sometimes also with Eric Budish. And then throughout the talk, there will be bits and pieces from other NFT and token design collaborations, many different people involved in that. And this is sort of a list of not even an exhaustive list, but many of the collaborators who have been helping and shape my thinking here. And then last, and this is possibly a first, last first, interesting. Didn't intend that to be a sort of implicit pun, but I guess it is. The Leet Skulls Sirs, another one of the vectors into this project, came from thinking about community launch from an actual NFT-based community, and I'll talk about our work there as well. Second part of the preamble, lots of disclosures. First of all, I myself hold lots of NFTs, including from many of the communities that I'll be speaking about. In fact, I'll be showing a lot of imagery associated to NFTs I actually own. So illustrations are actually my NFTs, except as otherwise indicated. None of this should be taken as a statement about those specific NFTs or whatever. I'm just using them to illustrate some of the dynamics that go on in the market, sort of framing the mechanism design exercise. There'll be a bunch of disclosures for A16Z crypto, which will be on the next slide. And then lastly, I have one co-author who's on an ERC grant and another who works at the IMF. So these also do not represent the views of the EU or the European Research Council or the IMF, its executive board, or IMF management, or A16Z crypto. The views expressed here are those of the individual. I'm not going to, myself, I'm not going to read all of it. But it's not the views of A16Z or its affiliates, and it is also certainly not legal, business, investment, or tax advice. If you're watching the video stream, you can freeze this slide to see the full disclosures. See more at a16z.com/disclosures for additional important information. All right, preamble almost done. I don't normally feature acknowledgments in the preamble, but here this time really, major shout outs needed, both to the organizers and especially to the staff team that's been running this, all the logistics for the event. I know it's been particularly complex to figure out how to project, not to figure out, but to enable me to project into the room. So thank you so much for making it possible for me to be here despite health issues. So QED. All right, with that, we're going to go. just one other footnote, this is all work in progress. In fact, the optimal membership design material, this is going to be the very first time I've presented it. So please shout out questions, especially if anything's unclear. Totally possible, right? The advantage and the risk of giving a keynote talk with a completely new paper sort of green field is that hopefully it'll be really cool and you'll all be like, wow, like we got to see the first version of that, but also like, something might be poorly notated or poorly framed, or, we might, later sharpen a result and make it more precise, take a condition down to an even narrower bound. So this is all work in progress, under construction. Please feel free to ask questions during the talk, especially I don't have a visual on the room. So I can't tell if I'm moving too quickly or too slowly. I can't tell if people are like, raising their hands. So just like, shout out, grab a mic, and we'll talk. All right. So for this audience, it's probably, not news. The tokens often serve to anchor membership in a community. And that's going to be sort of a group of people who form identity and group identity around the token. So this takes many different forms and it varies from context to context. A lot of what we're talking about today is going to be digital brands where the tokens are anchoring a community of brand enthusiasts, people who love, the subducts or, divine anarchy, like one of, a series of characters or imagery or motifs created around, in this case, images associated with the tokens, in the same way that people might be enthusiasts of a streetwear brand, or a favorite pizza company or something of the sort. And what do I mean by the token anchors? The token is anchoring membership in the sense that owning the token, owning the digital asset, is your sort of ticket to membership, right? Just like if you're a fan of Adidas, owning an Adidas sweatshirt or hoodie or something might be your anchor into the Adidas brand. Here, owning the token is your connection to the brand. But moreover, and again, especially on, in the context we think about most commonly, which is NFTs on public blockchains, it's not just a brand asset. It's not just you own a hoodie, but rather it's a link into a network, right? It's everybody else who also has that token can sort of see yours and potentially interact with you through it. And even people who don't have that token can see that you're an enthusiast and potentially interact. And in particular, the creator of the token also, right? The person who launched the brand has a way to sort of interact with all of their followers in a way that Adidas can't necessarily, sort of stay in bi-directional contact with all the people who bought their hoodies or something of the sorts. Again, so digital brand building is one context. Another, think about developers, right? A community of developers around an L1 or, an application with its own application token. And then even users of a platform, right? And this is perhaps a little bit less immediately sort of intuitive, but if you think about users, think about like an online game where owning the associated digital assets is a component of your play in the game, and maybe you use them to power your play in the game. Again, it's like, having the asset is the thing that anchors you into the community of players and enables you to participate. So once we start thinking of tokens as community anchors, there's a question of like, how should we actually decide who should be in this community, right? What is the proper way to determine membership in a token, in a token-based community? And what we're going to do today is introduce a framework for thinking about this question. It's what we're going to call optimal membership design. And the key defining feature of this model is going to be that there are cross-member externalities, which may depend on both observable and private information. So, it might be the case that we know that developers are valued. You have a platform that has some developers and some ordinary consumers, and there's cross-member externalities because if you have no developers, the consumer experience is not very good. And so, two-sided-ish platform with developers externalities on consumers, there might also be congestion externalities on the consumer side, right? Sort of they're competing for for developer time to build whatever their most demanded product is or something of the sort. Maybe there's even consumer complementarities, right? There's a network effect, the more consumers there are. And observing who's a developer and observing who's a consumer tells you something about the externalities, right? Consumer externalities are going to be, sort of among themselves. Developers will have externalities potentially on each other and then also on consumers. But it also might have to do with private information, right? How much you contribute to the network effect might depend on how often you're planning on using the platform, which is a function of how much you value being on the platform in the first place. Similarly, like, some developers are really going to invest hard and want to make the platform spectacular, and others might not be as invested in it. And so the membership design problem is going to be about sort of eliciting the relevant externality information, and through people's behavior in the market, a combination of sort of various like price and access options. And so has to be incentive compatible. We have to sort of elicit people's willingness to pay incentive compatibly. We're going to mostly throughout the talk be talking about revenue maximization. You can also do this if you have additional welfare goals, like, you want an equal distribution of participants across geographies or something like that. You have your sort of individual welfare weights as a function of agents types. But to form one of these communities optimally, you're going to set up a mechanism that sort of interpolates or integrates, is I guess the right word, all of these different externalities. And what we find is that an optimal mechanism has group-specific pricing and also potentially, and we'll talk about when this happens, multiple price and access tiers within a given group. And then, and this is sort of like a mathematical miracle that's come up in some of Piotr's and Mohammed's and my other work, and in much of this sort of, much of the mechanism design work that's based on concavification, that the total number of prices, so you actually might have like many different price and access tiers within a group, but the total number of prices and tiers across the entire mechanism is actually like reasonably small. It's, we have a reasonably small bound on it that's much smaller than you might naturally expect. Moreover, you can sort of talk about the market design implications. So it's not just an existential theorem that tells you here's the structure of an optimal mechanism. We can talk about which pricing formats you use when, and really what it's going to determine or be determined by is sort of the trade-off between the virtual values, right, the contribution to revenue or potentially other welfare objectives of recruiting a given group of agents, and those agents' externalities. And so we might find ourselves both using group-specific pricing to target groups that have particularly high externalities, right? You might have, lower or even negative prices for developers and positive prices for consumers, for example. But then you also might use this, multiple tiers within a group as a way of screening agents based on their purchasing behavior to sort of find certain categories of agents based on, which price and access tier they choose to buy. We'll talk about that in more detail, but the intuition there is, think about a concert or, sort of other, event where fandom is very critical. It's possible that the people with the highest ability to pay and thus the highest willingness to pay are not the top fans, right? That sort of, those might be your, your very wealthy consultants, and you might want to have some of them at your event because you can raise a lot of revenue from them, but the event's going to be much more fun. Sorry, I don't mean to suggest that consultants aren't Taylor Swift's fans. Also, by the way, I can't hear if anyone's laughing. So if something is really funny, you should laugh really, really hard. And if it's not funny, apologies, but I won't know. You might have top fans who can't afford to buy at the sort of maximum access tier, but you still want to get access to them as well. And that, might look like a form of lottery, sort of like access with rationing or just a lower quality of seat or something of the sort. The exact same thing is going to be true in these token-based communities. And then last, and this actually I thought was, this was interesting to me because it sort of identified something that I did not feel like I had as good an intuition for ex ante before having worked through this theory. The optimal price really might involve token scarcity, right? So a lot of times when I talk with teams that are thinking about how to structure their token design, they put a lot of weight on scarcity, especially at the outset. And I'm usually in a position of saying, like, wait a minute, hang on, like, like, yes, some tokens are very scarce, but like that's not necessarily optimal. Actually, here it's going to turn out to be a component in a class of in a class of circumstances I'll describe. This sort of sharp scarcity thing is actually going to turn out to be a direct consequence of needing to recruit people with the right externalities. And so it's possible it's possible that it's actually serving a practical role a little bit different, I think, from the one that it's often talked about, but sort of like in the same direction. So there may be a role for scarcity even in the optimal mechanism, and then we'll also see there's definitely a role for token vesting. So the last syllogism on the slide, which I've sort of already hinted at, the structure of the optimal mechanism we're going to find is going to motivate a lot of token allocation mechanisms we've seen in practice, and I'll talk about examples of those as well. All right, let me pause very quickly. That was the overview slide, where this is sort of where we're going. Before I start taking us there, any questions about the roadmap? And again, I can't see people shaking their heads, so I'll just like do a going once, going twice. All right, sold. So what is an NFT? An NFT is an individually unique digital record. Not to mean that there's sort of like always, sort of completely unique, like there might be, editions of them or something of the sort. Lots of NFTs come in multiple copies, but critically, it's a distinguishable digital record, often recorded on a blockchain and often linked to other digital or physical assets. So for example, here is the image associated to my Subduck NFT. Subducks is the very first NFT brand I became a part of, and really like, sort of I got there through desire to be part of the community of holders. And what does it mean that I own this Subduck? Well, what I really own is an ERC 721 token on the Ethereum blockchain associated to this Subduck image, numbered 6484. And so, there's a snapshot of the Etherscan record transferring that token into my control. I became owner of this token, and what that really means is I sort of have a digital deed, right? I have a digital deed to the image, but it's more than just an image, right? Or it can be, right? So like some NFTs are just deeds to imagery, but in the case of Subducks and in the case of many others, it's actually more than that. It's a deed to a membership in a community of all the people who hold Subducks. And what does it mean to be in that community? Well, these people like self-identify on Twitter. There's a Discord server, where the people who hold the token get token-gated access to a special, series of chat channels where they can chat with each other. Various activations occur. They hold live events where, people who hold the tokens can get together. And these aren't just held by the creators of Subducks, right? There's also a lot of activity by other members of the community. For example, 2 years ago for Halloween, one of the other members of Subducks created a Halloween costume. Sorry, Halloween's coming up. I should have brought the image, but he created a version of my Subduck in a Halloween costume. More broadly, like I've made friends. I co-authored a book with somebody I met through Subduck, Steve Kaczynski. And so the token sort of serves as a digital deed for the image, but also for this membership in this group, and people in the group interact with each other often and exert some degrees of externalities on each other. We're going to focus on these types of membership NFTs today. So the network of holders constitutes a community. And as I said, many NFT creators actually seek to build this actively, right? They want holders to feel identity around the digital assets, like I am a Subduck, I am a whatever, as a way of building a digital brand. NFTs represent a form of affiliation, right? Like the digital deed to not just an image, but also a membership and access. And as I said before, this community of holders can be a core source of decentralized value creation. And again, why does that work? Well, the token is the way to verify membership, right? If I want to give something to all the other subducts or subducts holders, right? You hear I'm using the term interchangeably. Like, what does it mean to be a subducts holder? People refer to themselves as subducts. If I want to give something to everyone who holds such an NFT, I can just airdrop it to them on the Ethereum blockchain or the L2 of your choice. And moreover, digital ownership, just like ownership of physical property, can incentivize this sort of value creating activity, right? Why is someone incentivized to create Halloween costumes for other people's subducts? Well, because they too hold subducts, and the more people enjoy being a part of the community, the more interesting people come in, the more value is created, and also potentially, eventually, the higher the value attached to the individual NFT. Sorry. And of course, I'm going to be talking about NFT communities in these motivating examples, but this is very much not limited to NFT communities, right? The same types of dynamics arrive in many other token-based community settings. This is DAOs, this is Web3 open source projects, and so forth. But the reason NFTs make such a good illustration for, especially for a talk, is that these visual elements actually contribute to the story. So when I first started studying NFTs and NFT-based brand building, I admit I was like thoroughly puzzled why everything was so heavily anchored on images, right? And one possibility, of course, is that just like images are an easy form of digital data for people to create. And, ownership, NFTs as ownership records is sort of an easy, natural first use case. How do you sell a piece of digital art? It was previously hard. Now it's much easier. But the more I explored these NFT communities, the more I realized that's only part of the story. The aesthetics of the image and surrounding media are often part of what we would call it like a shared text, a sort of a shared set of signifiers and understandings that people can anchor onto and become excited about. And you can see differences in aesthetics, right? Like, what is Subduck saying? I'm a cool, sort of duck whistling. Forgotten Runes, like, these are, I'm into wizards, maybe, old 8-bit games, magic, fantasy, and gaming. Azuki, right? Like I'm somehow interested in the anime aesthetic. And people cluster into these communities based on an interest in the aesthetic, and it's a way of finding other people with similar interests, right? It supercharges that externality component because you're ending up in a group with people mostly, or at least in large part, kind of like you on some dimension. At least you share an aesthetic and a set of interests. And of course, the ideal communities might have many different types of people in them, right? So like, the majority, I would say, of holders of most digital brand NFTs are just enthusiasts or consumers. Sometimes, right, you might want people who are intrinsically high value there, that maybe in a way that creates value just through their participation. So this is like, maybe you have a celebrity and now people, like, sort of by being in the community, feel attached to the celebrity, and that drives up the value for everyone. And maybe you also want some people who are really going to contribute. These are the developers or people like creating costumes or just evangelizing the brand, telling people how awesome it is. So it's becoming like a decentralized marketing arm for the brand. Of course, every person might serve in each role to some degree, right? And you might be intrinsically high value for some type, and have sort of high default externalities on some users, and others you only, create externalities once you start building stuff. But crucially, like when you're designing one of these communities, or if you're going to launch an NFT-based community, you care a lot about the membership externalities. You're looking for members who are either creating value for the brand directly or for other members in the community. And so, it almost sounds like obvious saying it now, but like it was a realization for me when I first noticed that a token-based community is really just another form of platform. It might be a one-sided platform, it might be a multi-sided platform, but what matters is these like cross-user externalities, the roles different members play in enhancing each other's membership. So how do you bring people into such a community? Well, you know what your product is, right? You sort of know what your brand is trying to be, or like what types of products they're building. Are you building a digital game? Are you building a t-shirt brand? I don't know. And there's actually a lot of information floating around that can tell you about who might be an ideal member. So first case study, just thinking about these various anime digital brands. So here we have imagery from Divine Anarchy in the center, Inkugami on the left, and that was that Azuki elemental on the right. And perhaps it might not be surprising to learn that there are lots of people with, if you like the aesthetic of one of these, you're likely to like the aesthetic of the others. And even more than that, a lot of the people in these communities are anime mega fans, different forms, different animes, different genres, and so forth. But if you find yourself in the web of anime NFT communities, it is likely that you are into anime. And so if you're launching a new anime NFT community, you can leverage that directly, right? You have on-chain data on who is interested in anime. And that's exactly what a lot of anime NFT communities do now. So Conviction, which launched just recently, literally had a series of partnerships and more broadly a chain scanner that would look at which NFTs you own, and in particular, which anime NFTs you own, as a way of figuring out whether you were the type of person who was likely to also want to be a member of their community. And moreover, they also had an application process where they asked you questions about your interest in anime, what what you had nostalgia for, and so forth, as a way of figuring out who was likely to be, sort of really attached to the community, who was going to stick around and contribute and help them with their project of building an anime studio. And crucially, sort of if you passed one of these two ERIS or Form 773 application processes, you were given early access to join at a reduced price. And we'll come back to that minting mechanism in a little bit. One other illustration, I mentioned the Leet Skulls. So when we launched, we were launching a CC's, a digital brand and I don't know, Leet Hacker Collective, Hacksaw, not hacker. We're not actually hackers. We're tinkerers, Leet Tinkerer Collective, based around various NFT artwork and imagery that's been licensed under Creative Commons Zero, CC0. And the idea is to sort of build like a nexus of all these different CC0 projects. And similarly to the way Conviction launched, we leveraged a lot of on-chain information, data, and sort of like people's other holdings and reputation to find people who seem to be CC0 enthusiasts. And even more than that, to the extent that we could, we thought were likely to contribute to actually building and creating more. So it's a creator collective. People are doing their own work off of various CC0 themes and motifs. And so the goal was to bring in people who shared those goals and interests. And so, we worked through a series of different NFT communities, starting first with Trusted Ties, places where we were, very close, and everything was free, but we gave different lengths of minting windows and degrees of access, to, sort of first people who we knew, sort of like, one rung of Trusted Ties around, and then gradually expanded outwards, but always trying to leverage, again, this information about who was collecting various CC0 projects, who was engaging with the Leet brand as we were running through the mint process, all with an idea of bringing in people who were going to want to be attached to the brand, want to contribute and help build, sort of the Leet or the Leetist CC0 content we could produce. So lots of public observable information or directly listable, like, what is your favorite anime? It's a little bit hard to falsify that one. Well, it at least requires effort to falsify that one, But of course, not everything is observable, right? Even if you give out Leet Skulls NFTs to lots of people who hold CC0 collections, you don't really know whether they're going to stick around. You don't really know whether they're going to engage heavily. Because there's also private information, right? Maybe someone is just, not that interested or not interested in investing effort. And so you also might want to elicit information through the sales or minting mechanism. And all of that together brings us to our mechanism design problem. But let me pause for a quick second and ask if there are any questions. Going once, twice. All right. I hear slight chuckling, so we will call that sold. So hopefully now we've motivated this member externality concept. We're now about to do some mechanism design. I should just quickly flag that, I've used NFTs as this motivating example, but it's not just NFT community formation. It's also, as I said, developer communities, DAOs, online games, live concerts, and maybe even executive education programs where you figure the experience and information and potentially even the network connections of other people in the program might influence the value to any given participant. So very broad general framework, but we're going to stick with NFT communities today. So we're trying to allocate this membership, and an agent is going to have sort of a two-part type. So agents types are going to contain an observable group label. So that's, do you hold other anime NFTs, or are you a professor, or I don't know, have you spent way too much time, producing slides? And then there's an unobserved rather willingness to pay. Like how much do you intend to invest in this anime community? How much do you value being a part of this? What is your value for experience quality? And then agents are going to have these cross-group externalities. And note, so externality of type I on J, we'll probably change this notation to feature an arrow or something, but we're using the convention that it's I on J, so left on right. Can be positive or negative. So you can imagine that there are like advertisers or otherwise negative externalities on the platform as well. And they also might depend on R, right? So, and could depend on R in lots of ways, right? So maybe having really high R, high value for the community, also means you're going to invest a lot, so your externality is really high. Maybe high R means you're just really wealthy, so you can afford to spend a lot of money on community membership, but you're planning on being totally checked out. And you actually care about the externality from the lower, the medium R individuals. Those are the ones who are like really going to work hard. They're excited. They're thrilled to be there. Think again of that, concert where perhaps the wealthiest ticket buyers are actually not the ones who are going to be, screaming and shouting and contributing to the atmosphere. The ordinary case in my mind, at least, is that R equals 0, when you have no interest in being in the community, your externality is probably very low. And when R is really high, that's probably the case where you also, maybe, it might be that you're very engaged, right? So for some types of communities, it's just going to be monotone increasing in R, but often really high R is going to be a sign of high ability to pay rather than particularly high demand per se. Those might be people who are investing in collecting lots of tokens, but aren't putting a lot of direct energy into any of the individual communities. And so it's the intermediate R's where we really expect the externalities to be high in a lot of these NFT contexts.
I have one question for you.
Please, yes.
Hi, yeah. So it looks like EIJR is the R there is of agent I. I could imagine also that would be the R of agent J. So if I see somebody that really values it, maybe I'm a scammer and I come and I'm taking advantage of them.
Right. Good. I believe, I have to check on this. I think maybe we could have the externalities flow in either one direction or the other, but not both or something for the machinery. It's true. I've been thinking about this in the level of investment externalities from the participants, but you could, I guess, imagine that's exactly right. That the high externalities depend on, the recipient type in some way. Super interesting. I certainly don't want to be condoning optimal membership design for scam communities. Hopefully that got a laugh. But this reverse directional externality thing does seem like it has has resonance. Again, thinking about executive education or something, maybe it matters who the recipient of your contributions is to determine the value of your contribution. In a classroom or something like that. Super interesting. I don't know off the top of my head, but I think my instinct is we should be able to do the reverse version, but it may be hard to do both. Great question. Thank you. Good suggestion. Further questions? Cool. All right. Type distribution known, externality matrix known, but again, R itself is unobserved. Cool. Agent's utility of membership is going to be a function of the total externality created by the other members, scaled by willingness to pay. So an agent of type I and R is going to have utility R times this value function, which is going to be a strictly increasing function of all of the aggregated externalities. Note, by the way, so in light of that question, I should particularly highlight that inside this integral, it's EJI. So we switched the direction. So now these are the externalities from J on the agent of group I. Sorry. but exactly, times what, the level of allocation you receive, potentially net of a transfer. G will, I guess we'll need it. We actually will need it at one place. This is the CDF of willingness to pay. So that's just the distribution of willingness to pay in a given group. Designer is going to have access to arbitrary direct allocation mechanisms and is going to maximize revenue subject to IC and IR constraints. And again, accounting for externalities. So there's a little bit of a like fixed point like thing going on here. Sort of suitably transformed, this problem just turns into choosing the allocation. Again, sort of allocation here is going to be, for an agent of a given group with a given willingness to pay. Non-decreasing, coming out of the IC constraint, the incentive constraint, and then you're maximizing here in this formulation total revenue. So there's a virtual value revenue term here with the externality object incorporated. So adding up across all the different groups, the aggregate externality received by that group, scaled by the virtual values of all the members in the group who end up joining, or all the agents in the group who end up becoming members. So it's actually a very standard mechanism design formulation, just with this, sort of massive, bulky externality term being carried around throughout. Any questions about that? This is actually like, I think of this as being notationally messy, but actually pretty standard so far. Going once, twice, cool. And so critically, so you can see from that setup, the tension is going to be between giving an agent membership as a way of raising revenue and giving an agent membership as a way of changing the value that everyone else gets for membership. So like if there were no externalities, you would just want to maximize revenue. You get back, your standard optimal revenue problem. But with the externalities, we actually care a lot about the composition. And we might bring in some agents who contribute very little to revenue because we know that they're going to create a lot of value for everyone else, and that in turn can contribute to revenue. Again, as I said, and I'll have a slide about this at the end, we can do all of this as well with like more complex welfare objectives. Rather than just revenue, you can have sort of like, various social welfare weights, but looking at the revenue maximization version will really like highlight all the key dynamics. And it turns out, right, so sort of like it's a mathematical miracle a little bit, but there's actually going to be a reasonably clean characterization of the optimal mechanism, because really what we're doing is we're, concavifying like an externality balanced, virtual value function, right? So there's a virtual revenue function, but with this additional externality balancing term reflecting that trade-off. And so Karateodoi's theorem is going to tell us that the optimal mechanism is actually supported on a reasonably small number of points. And then by strange miracle, it's going to be a small number of points within each group, but actually some of those are going to turn out to be, sort of unnecessary because, the externalities of one group affect every other group. And so some constraints become redundant. All of that, sort of sketch of proof said, what's the optimal mechanism? An L-tiered pricing mechanism will offer L different prices, of course, with different allocations at each price. So for example, a one-tiered pricing mechanism is a posted price, a two-tiered pricing, and we'll see this, later has full access at a high price and partial access at a lower price, we'll be looking really at the range of the sort of externality functions. So as a function of the allocation. So if we write down the externality function as a function of the input allocation, if there are no externalities, then this range has dimension 0. If externalities are constant across a pair of groups, then the externality function has dimension 1. Linear, so think like sort of, I guess like almost like a linear, like almost interpreted as a linear regression of like characteristics on outcomes or something like that. Dimension 2. An optimal mechanism is going to use tiered pricing in every group, and the number of tiers within a group is going to be less than or equal to the dimension of this externality function plus 1. So in particular, and we'll have this on the top of the next slide, if there are no externalities, you just get a posted price. If externality, in a given group, if the externalities are constant, then you're going to get, at most 2 prices. And then moreover, as I mentioned, that's a very clean characterization within a group. In fact, the total number of prices across the entire mechanism is going to be bounded as well by 2 times the number of groups. And this is going to be because, things we do to attract agents of one type in one group for the sake of attracting agents in other groups might remove the need to do unusual pricing to attract those other agents. There's sort of a substitution between pricing to attract agents to draw other agents in or pricing to those other agents directly. Okay. So sometimes a posted price is going to be optimal. One case which follows immediately from that result, from the part 1 of that result, as I said, is that if a group does not exert any externalities, then the posted price mechanism is optimal for that group. And so the presence of this is sort of like a baseline result, but it has economic content. Interesting. Something just dinged. I don't know if that was someone raising their hand. Probably not.
Nope,
All
we're
right.
good.
Cool. Externalities are a necessary condition for within group access tiers to be optimal. So if you're going to have multiple tiers within an observably identifiable group, it has to be the case that this has something to do with the presence of externalities. Meanwhile, also, we're going to have posted price mechanisms when we're in that case where there's like sort of nice alignment between people's marginal revenue contribution and the externalities. So this is like, when the really, really high value, people who have really high values for participating are also really high value participants. Then again, we're just going to get posted pricing. So, and the intuition there is just that in that context, the revenue and value creation goals are aligned. Right, you're only going to get sort of unusual pricing mechanisms when there's a difference between revenue or some tension between revenue and value creation. All of that said, we might still have varied pricing across groups. Right, this doesn't say there's a single posted price for everyone. It says there's a posted price for that group, and you might very much want to have like groups that just like exert like a higher constant externality on everyone. They might have a much lower price because they have a high externality. And then again, as I was hinting, and we'll talk about that in detail in a second, you also might have a low price with rationing if agents in that group just have high externalities, right? So like, if you really want to recruit developers, you might subsidize developers under the optimal membership scheme in a way that might induce rationing, right? Like you might, you might have like a price below the effective clearing price for developer membership in order to take advantage of finding those with especially high externalities. Think of that again. Maybe that's really like the ticketing example again. So. Or it's a component of the ticketing example. So forget about the very wealthy people who are buying fancy tickets. But if you know that you have fans, like you have verified fans, and this really exists, the Ticketmaster operates a service called Verified Fan that lets you identify like who your biggest fans are through various activities. If you have verified fans, you might place a low price for them with rationing simply to attract that group of people. You care a lot about having those people be able to participate because of their high externalities on each other and on other participants through the through the energy they bring to the event. Let me pause there. That was sort of like stack of sort of first set of results. There are going to be sort of 3 of them. So let me pause at that one and ask quickly if there are any questions. Stack 1, 2, sold. All right. And then off of that same intuition, so we just talked about if you know who your fans are, right? If you have verified fan and can just target them directly, you might have a single price for all verified fans that's just below sort of effective market clearing. Because of the externality, right? You're subsidizing those people because they exert an externality on everyone else and each other. You also might have multiple prices, sort of like 2-tiered pricing, for example, within an individual side of the market, if there are low willingness to pay agents who create strong positive externalities. And there's where you get this mechanism where there's full access at a high price and like rationed access at a low price. So this is, again, this is the original version of the ticketing example I described. You have a concert where you don't necessarily know who your fans are up front, but you can see that like some people have very high ability to pay. You might sell to them directly and then, also offer like a rationed set of tickets to try and screen in some of the people who are high externality but low willingness or ability to pay. And again, this is the same thing also I mentioned in NFT communities. If you have ex-ante unidentifiable whales, people are just going to like buy a bunch of tokens and then sit and wait for the community to get developed, but not actually contribute themselves. Those people also might be hard to identify. And so again, you might want like a ration tier, like a whitelist or an allow list rather for, some set of people, with rationing prices, or even just like a high price pre-sale followed by a low price rationed sale. So already we see sort of starting to appear a number of minting mechanisms and other sort of like sales mechanisms we see in practice, right? Market design implication 1, group-specific pricing is optimal to the extent that you can differentiate, observe differentiating features. And this really motivates the idea of that wave mint that I mentioned earlier. And then there also might be tiered pricing within group in order to find the low willingness to pay agents with high externalities. And this motivates allow lists. And then also, as I said, like a guaranteed purchase pre-sale followed by a discounted price with rationing. And then last, of course, when the externality really dominates relative to people's willingness to pay, sort of the revenue contribution, free mints actually might be optimal. So when like basically the entire value of a project ex ante is in the externalities of the people holding it, then the optimal mechanism is actually a free mint. And that's, I don't want to take views on precisely which projects have chosen to be free minting, but a lot of free mint projects have really taken the posture that like, we're putting this out as a community anchor and like, you guys can build around it whatever you want. And that looks a lot like this idea that you're sort of saying like, look, the main value of this community is really just incorporating the externalities of who shows up. And then the optimal mechanism is actually a free mint. So I mentioned verified fan. Taylor Swift was one of the first people to try that out using Ticketmaster's verified fan long before NFTs were a mode of verification. And now Ticketmaster has launched. Sorry, go ahead. Question.
We have a question.
Yes.
So take your free mint idea to the another extreme. You can actually pay people to join. So if you think about those paid celebrity endorsement of an NFT, is it kind of an example of that?
Totally, 100%. Yeah. So another, right, prices could totally be negative. And in particular, if there's a group with really high externalities, let's see, where are we? Really high externalities, but very low willingness to pay in some form, you might indeed very much get like a negative price for them, a net total subsidy completely. So you might, go ahead.
Oh, wait, one more question.
Please.
So, thank you very much, Scott. Very interesting. One question here is your pricing strategy here? Can I interpret it as generalization of multi-sided pricing? Because now you can
absolutely
identify many more groups and different types within the groups, but you can identify them a priori, and therefore you can target different pricing strategies to optimize for the network effect. So kind of
Absolutely.
what we do in two-sided markets, including subsidization, just in a generalized form for IJ groups.
100%. Absolutely. So, and we don't, I didn't bring a slide on it, but one thing we can do is reproduce a like, Rocher-Tirole looking like, sort of like cross-side, sort of cross-side subsidy type structure. So exactly, it's very much, this is a generalization of the multi-sided platform pricing problem, but also the only other thing to note is that, the groups identify the sides or the sort of different observably distinguished groups of agents. But even within group, you might not have a uniform price, as a lot of the multi-sided platform literature works off of, but rather the optimal mechanism might be this type of price menu that screens agents, externality levels based on their willingness to pay. We learn something about the agent from which bucket they sort into. Do you buy the super high tier access at a high price or the partial access at a lower price? That tells us whether you might be that person who has the high externalities but low ability to pay. So it sort of generalizes on two different dimensions. One is sort of like number of memberships, number of membership groups, agent groups. And then the other is within each group, we're running a much more complicated or potentially complicated mechanism. And all of those various alternative pricing schemes interact across the mechanism. Exactly. Cool. All right, I know we're running a little bit short on time. We started, I think, at 04, and I'll try and end at 06 or so. Right, I mentioned theory and practice. Taylor Swift introduced this verified fan. Ticketmaster has now gone to NFT-based token gating, as an even more robust form of verified fan identification. If you, like me, are wondering what this picture was on their official announcement of Ticketmaster launching token-gated sales, this is apparently Avenged Sevenfold's token-gated ticket sale for the Deathbat NFT holders. So happy Halloween! I really appreciate whatever corporate comms person decided that it was okay to put a Deathbat on the Ticketmaster ad or announcement. We also, as I said, seen this type of mechanism in many different NFT communities. It's a version of what Conviction did. It's a version, again, of this wave mint idea. Here's a reference from Tally Labs, where they explicitly configured pricing to have a discount. They ran an auction to determine the base price for their Bored and Dangerous book NFTs. But then their established community members and other people who had gained access via various engagement activities got a strict discount on that. And exactly the same idea. It's like using group identification potentially along with price discovery as a way of selecting in members who you think are going to be very attached and contribute a lot to the community. Last math point. We just barely have enough time to do this, I think. So you can also ask about, so far we've sort of been imagining we're forming a static community. You can also ask about token communities with liquid resale. So here, imagine there's a market resale price, homogeneous goods. And now R, this willingness to pay, is really your belief about future value from the perspective of the agent. R less than 1, you want to sell immediately. You think it's worth less than sort of the current market price. R greater than 1, you think that there's ongoing value. And we have, maybe consumers and developers, and there's a congestion externality. It's really a token scarcity externality. If there are, too many consumers, maybe there, too many token holders, maybe they're going to use up all the functionality of the platform in some way. And meanwhile, the developers also have the same congestion externality, but also generate value as a function of their participation. So first of all, unless you introduce vesting, if the tokens can be sold immediately, anyone you give it to with R less than 1 is going to sell immediately. And so you have to truncate your allocation at people who, sort of are not going to resell unless you have a way to do vesting. And so the question is, when can the community sort of form in a way where the net externality is positive? Again, to make this precise, there's a footnote. We need it to be the case that the V function, when the total allocation hits a point where It's like when total externalities go like really negative, we have to actually cut it off. Otherwise, you end up subsidizing to avoid really negative values. But that's a footnote. First of all, once you introduce vesting, you slacken the condition you need for sort of net externality to potentially be positive. And then, assuming that you have the possibility of a net positive externality, we can ask, how do we think about price? Well, it's going to determine some optimal developer externality, and the consumer price is going to be relative to that developer externality. And you get from the first order condition, you just see that the measure of consumers actually has to be related to that developer externality. Like the price has to be high enough to maintain scarcity relative to sort of total developer engagement. And so this motivates these ideas that, again, this is a mechanism we see frequently where you might have developers receive tokens with vesting and a very, very small amount of consumer distribution until the token community has its own sort of ecosystem, sort of built around it. And then you start, sort of distributing more out. And that comes very simply, again, out of this framework, right? The idea is that you actually might want a lot of scarcity in the consumer market up front as a way of, in effect, giving enough value to the developers to get them to actually contribute and build their, build their externalities. We don't have dynamics in this model, but the natural way to think about it is over time, the externalities grow the value of participation in a way that then means you can expand consumer access as well. So vesting expands the scope of potential projects, and then scarcity, and again, price screening on willingness to pay. You also here really want to screen your consumers. You want the ones who have the highest demand for participation, the highest estimate, the R greater than 1, the future estimate of value of the platform, to be the ones who join early on. And as I said, this is a set of intuitions that we see often in practice in the design of early token distributions. I mentioned you can do all of this again with distributional preferences. In general, that's going to reinforce these dynamics. You might have group-specific pricing just to, for specific groups that you want to attract. And moreover, you might have another reason for low prices with rationing, which is that sometimes willingness to pay might reveal inequality. And I've sort of been saying that casually a little bit, right? The high payers for an event ticket might be the ones with high ability to pay. When you have distributional goals that involve targeting access to people with low ability to pay or otherwise low willingness to pay, that would be another reason to have low prices with rationing. There's a small sleight of hand here. These effects are riffing off of a different paper in this series, redistributive allocation mechanisms with Akbarpour and Dvorak, but very similar framework and same underlying idea here. So that's the story. So tokens serve to anchor membership in a community. And as we saw, that happens in many different contexts: brands, developers, platform users, whatever. From there, we derive this optimal membership design question. And the key feature is these cross-member externalities within the community. And we find the optimal mechanism has group-specific pricing, multiple price access tiers under certain circumstances related, again, to the scale of those externalities and how they relate to willingness to pay. And then sort of by mathematical miracle, a small number of prices in total. And this, sort of motivates a lot of different token allocation mechanisms we've seen in practice. And so, because it's always good when your theory teaches you that what's going on in the world actually makes sense. I guess it's better than the alternative a lot of the time. But particularly for me, right, sort of these token sale design patterns have been so persistent. You naturally have an intuition that maybe they're doing something right, and this system here, this framework here really sort of shows us that they in fact are. And of course, this isn't just a story about tokens per se, right? We've mentioned concert tickets. I mentioned, executive education programs, maybe country clubs, but tokens are a paradigmatic example. And and we've been saying this implicitly, but let me say it explicitly. The other cool thing about tokens is not only does allocating membership, sort of help shape a token community, but also once you're in a token community, that can be used as a source of group labels for others as well. So tokens are a paradigmatic and self-propagating example of optimal membership design. And maybe that's the place to close. So remember, we had this slide at the beginning where I said, what is an NFT? And we're focusing today on these membership NFTs, where the network of holders constitutes a community. But at some level, every token can anchor a community, right? If you get an NFT ticket to an event or like a academic conference, that can later become a source of shared identity. And people, if they wanted, could airdrop you, all sorts of exciting, sort of conference memorabilia or, or advertisements from conference sponsors or so forth. That's very much the message of the everything token. And in that spirit, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't, give us a token to serve as an anchor and source of shared identity. But sticking with this idea that, sort of identity through the image also tells us something about your type, which might be useful for like other brands to anchor onto, you actually get a choice between one of two. So if you scan this QR code, you should tell me whether you would like Tokenomics is Leet or Tokenomics is Divine, featuring Leet Skulls and Divine Anarchy, respectively. It's a Google form. You'll put in your address or ENS and an email address so I can write you if anything goes wrong. I promise not to spam you with lots and lots of advertisements. Although I guess when this paper becomes available, I might email everyone a copy, like a link to the paper or something of the sort. Cool. Thank you so much. Sorry for running a couple minutes over, but thank you so much for being here and for all the fantastic questions, and happy to talk more and or engage in NFT space. QED.
Yeah, I'm back.
I have a couple questions.
Great.
So, how far will the dynamics change if the willingness to pay is not actually monetary, but rather it becomes more like, how much time you are willing to spend, how drastically would the framework change?
It's a great question. So first of all, the simple answer is, to a first order, I think all of this all of the intuitive and like qualitative claims make sense in a world where we're talking about willingness to pay and time as well, right? Like the same sorts of screening goals, like everything we said about sort of how you want to structure your membership allocation mechanism, sort of the intuitions are the same. The difference technically is, if time is valuable to the designer, like if the time people spend is valuable to the designer, I think it probably is the same actually. But if time isn't revenue, right? Yeah. If time isn't money, again, I can't tell whether people are laughing, so I'll just imagine you guys are. If time isn't money, then the objective function of the designer looks different. Because we basically assumed that we're maximizing revenue with respect to those willingnesses to pay. And so I think you'd have to set up the optimization slightly differently, but I suspect you would find like basically the same qualitative ideas. And if time is money, right, it's like, the time I spend is like actually creating value for the brand in some way. I'm like, painting gigantic pictures of sup ducks on murals and like, posting about them on the internet or something. Then I think it would be pretty similar. Great question.
Great. Well, let's thank the speaker again.
All right, the math wrap up. You see that ball? That ball is a sphere. I put a loop on it. I can make it disappear, shrink it down to a point till it's small as can be. That's what I call the circle shrinking property. It's a well-known fact that if you're in 3D, you're a sphere if and only if you got the property. But a big open question due to Poincare here. If you're in 4D, are you still just a sphere? So that's the Poincare conjecture stated in, a slightly more wrap form than usual.